Good morning, everyone. So good morning and welcome to the friends and members of ANZSOC. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you here today to mark the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the inaugural meeting of the Australian and New Zealand Society of Criminology. It was on this day, exactly 50 years ago, that a diverse group of people, some of you here today, came together in the Japanese room at the University of Melbourne. Today is an opportunity to celebrate the establishment of our professional body and reflect on the many contributions that have been made to the development of criminology in Australia and New Zealand. A central tenet of all social science is that an understanding of the present is predicated upon an appreciation of the past, something that applies equally well to the study of criminology as a discipline. When listening to the histories of Australian and New Zealand criminology today, we will not necessarily discover a unifying thesis or a convergence of accounts, but rather we will create an anthology of multiple perspectives and arguments about the major issues, debates, controversies, and determinants of the development and rise of criminology in Australia and New Zealand.
Today I'll be discussing the role of Barry and the staff of the Melbourne Department of Criminology in the formation of the Society. In 1967, David Byles and his colleagues decided to form an Australian Society of Criminology. In Byles' words, and I'll quote here, "I recall Stan Johnston and I walking from the university to the Supreme Court to ask Sir John Barry if he would accept the position of President. He agreed on condition that it would be clearly understood that he had not sought the position." And as we know, in October, the university criminologists decided to follow up this approach and organised a public meeting to initiate the society. In 1960, Bartholomew had been recruited from the English prison service to be psychiatrist superintendent of Pentry Prison here in Melbourne. In his work in Melbourne, participating in parole board matters and lecturing part-time in the university's Department of Criminology brought him into regular contact with Barry. Barry was writing at the end of his first year in Melbourne. "With regards to your plans to initiate moves towards the formation of an Australian Association for the Advancement of Criminal Science, I can say at once that my first impression is that it's a good idea. However, in setting out some of my ideas on the subject, I become more and more concerned as to exactly how it would work." Bartholomew suggested that such an association could organise a congress, perhaps every 3 years or so. If such an idea was envisaged, could not the Australian Association be made the Australasian Association, thus bringing in New Zealand and the administration in New Guinea? On this occasion of the 50th anniversary, it seems worth recalling and commending Barry's vision of a Pacific society, including Asian membership, as an indication once again of the originality and prescience, in this respect, well ahead of his time.
I shall speak of wig, gown and stethoscope, personified by Sir John Barry, Professor Norval Morris and Dr. Alan Bartholomew. Two of the three were present at the birth of the Department of Criminology at the University of Melbourne in March 1951, Sir John Barry and Dr. Norval Morris, as he then was, and had been instrumental in its formation. Two of the three, Sir John and Dr. Bartholomew, were present at the birth of the Society on this place in 1967. Professor Morris was then Dean of the Chicago Law School, but I'm sure was present here in spirit. There is thus a cadence that we are all here today, 50 years on, celebrating the values that each of those three embodied. The minutes of the inaugural meeting of the Society record that Dr. Alan Bartholomew was present. Following the election of the Executive Committee, at which Sir John was elected President, the meeting notes that it was given a report by Dr. Bartholomew on preliminary discussions he has had regarding the presentation of a journal. Alan was a person of strong flavour and was idiosyncratic. Before I became a judge, Alan and I spent some long nights together considering sciolism and ended up well, almost anywhere. But that is a story for another day.
But I'd first like to thank the Society very warmly for the invitation to attend today's lunch and session and the events here. And it's an occasion for me, at least, of both joy and happy memories, and also, of course, of some sadness and reflection on many of the friends, the colleagues who have gone through the experience of the foundations of criminology in this country and are no longer still with us. In fact, those of us who were at that meeting in 1967 here in the former Japanese room are a small band of survivors, and I guess we are fortunate in a way to be here. I think I was 28 at the time, and certainly from the photograph that somehow Russell has been able to obtain, I had a lot more hair in those days than I recall. In 67, it was the year, of course, at which we had our referendum to establish that our first inhabitants, the indigenous people of this country, would be recognised as citizens. And it was momentous in that way. It was momentous too because in the criminological sense, I suppose the largest issue by far was that of the of capital punishment. And in February of 1967, just a few months, of course, before this meeting here took place, Ronald Ryan was hanged in Pentridge Prison, and it had a profound impact not only on the nation itself, but also on those who'd had to preside at that execution, which included Alan Bartholomew. And Alan would often go back and recall these events over some of the long sessions that we had to discuss these things. And Alan himself had to actually pronounce Ronald Ryan dead, a chore that he obviously was horrified by. And I think it was the end, it fortunately was the end of the use of capital punishment, but at that time we didn't have the foresight to see that was so. It was, in fact, also the time that I became involved with the journal, and at a separate meeting, and I had originally thought it was at this meeting, the first meeting of the society. It was an executive meeting in December, I'm reminded, of the same year, that Alan Bartholomew and I were invited to attend the meeting of the executive committee of the society here in Melbourne, and we were appointed, Alan as editor and I was appointed as the assistant editor of the journal. And for the next year or so I used to regularly commute down here to spend time with Alan as we published the first editions of the journal. The journal was published by Southdown Press, which was a special arrangement that Alan had somehow negotiated with them. Southdown Press was best known for publishing Truth, a well-known journal which Rupert Murdoch would have blushed at, I think. But it was, anyway, it was a document of some notoriety, but they published our journal. Quite a long time, I can't remember how many years, but they did a very good job.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. And as we're listening to the people who've already spoken, just really came to me what's at stake here. And what I mean by that is, what's it all about? And ultimately it's all about human beings and lives and hope and forgiveness and order in society. So many things that are really at stake in this whole area of justice and law and human beings. So it's just a privilege to be part of that in some small way at this meeting today. So what are we trying to do with these kids? It was to find ways to give them a chance to come to terms with what's happening in their lives. And so we tried to do that. And there were a couple of oddities in what was happening. One was that when kids were going to court, often
there was uncertainty in the minds of the magistrates as to what was the best thing to do, and one of the things was that one of the options that they had was to give youngsters a fixed sentence, or to make them create then a situation of wards of the state. And sometimes youngsters who really had done very little wrong, but were unable to find a family they could live with, and those youngsters became, sometimes when they just made wards of the state with no fixed sentence, and that was a very interesting situation. And then so when youngsters, after they say they might have been, were given sentences, and they were often in the same section of Tirana as kids who were in for major crime, and that was all seemed a strange, odd to us. And some of us say you could have a kid who was in there for really serious crime, and in the same room or same cell as kids who've done nothing wrong at all, and that was a very odd sort of situation. Anyway, look, there's some of the thoughts that have come to my mind, that there are so many good things being done in recent times, and I'm sure the contribution of this organisation that we're about today, of Criminology, it's got a very serious part to play. So thanks for your attention. Thank you.
I'd like to pay tribute to the very first ANZSOC treasurer. Mr. David Hundley served as treasurer for the society between 1967 and 1969, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, I was not here. Unfortunately, David passed away in the year 2000, and therefore cannot be with us here today to commemorate this joyous occasion. However, through some joint detective work by myself and Russell Smith, I actually managed to track down David's daughter, Ellen. Ellen was very happy to speak with me and shared some fond memories of her father, some of which I would like to relay here today. David Hundley was born in England. He served in the British military forces during World War II. One day he spotted an ad that said, "Come to Australia, we'll give you an education." So he came to Australia. He completed a BA, he completed a diploma of social work, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that he was the first person to graduate with a diploma in criminology from the University of Melbourne. That was in 1963. David Hundley knew Ronald Ryan through his work as a supervisor for classification and treatment of prisoners at Pentridge Prison. As you may have all guessed, David was opposed to the death penalty. In the years following Ronald Ryan's execution, David worked to improve the prison system. Among other things, he served as an expert witness on the Board of Inquiry into Pentridge Prison and discipline within the prison system. This was in 1973 and 1974. He also served on the Prison Advisory Council in 1974. Ultimately, however, the execution of Ronald Ryan left its mark, and David Hundley moved away from criminology.
Wow, this has been quite the day, hasn't it? Thank you to everyone for making the trip here today, whether it was across town or interstate or across the ditch. Once again, thank you for all your contributions today. As always, the strength of ANZSOC relies on what Kathleen Daly identified as our volunteerism. The success of ANZSOC today is in part the result of the efforts of those around the table today. And looking at the goodwill of the current Committee of Management, I'm pretty sure that the future is bright.